Rain had fallen for 3 days straight, turning the Hurtgen forest into a sea of mud and misery. Feldwebel Karl Brauer pressed his eye to the vision port of his Panzer IV and watched water snake down the armored glass. Somewhere beyond the gray curtain of weather, Americans waited. But today, the only enemy was boredom and cold. Inside the tank, his crew passed time the way soldiers always did. Werner, the gunner, read a letter from his wife for the 100th time. She had given birth to a daughter 3 weeks ago. He had never seen her face. Heinrich, the loader, carved a small wooden horse with his pocket knife, shavings falling onto the ammunition rack. Otto, the driver, slept with his head against the transmission housing, snoring softly despite the uncomfortable position. Karl knew these men better than he knew his own brothers. 2 years on the Eastern Front had forged them into something beyond friendship. They had fought at Kursk, retreated through Ukraine, and somehow survived when better men did not. The Panzer IV beneath them had become their home, their fortress, their reason for breathing another day. The tank's frontal armor measured 80 mm thick. Against Soviet 45mm guns, it held. Against early American Shermans with their short-barreled 75mm cannons, it held. Officers called the American tanks Ronsons because they lit up like cigarette lighters when hit. Easy prey, they said. Nothing to fear. Karl wanted to believe them. A motorcycle courier splashed through the mud and stopped beside their position. The rider handed Karl a folded message, then disappeared back into the rain. Karl read the orders twice. His company would advance at dawn to secure a crossroads near a bombed village called Bergstein. Intelligence reported only light American reconnaissance ahead. An easy assignment. Hold the position until reinforcements arrived. Easy. Karl hated that word. Nothing in war was easy. That evening, he walked among his men as they prepared for tomorrow. Replacement crews had arrived last week, boys with fresh uniforms and eager eyes. They still believed in final victory, in wonder weapons, in the Führer's promises. Karl remembered feeling that way once, before Kursk, before the endless retreat, before he learned that survival mattered more than glory. Near the command half-track, Oberleutnant Vogel stood smoking a cigarette. Vogel commanded a Panther tank, the newer model with its sloped armor and long-barreled 75mm gun. He was a veteran, quiet and careful with his words. When he spoke, men listened. Brauer, Vogel said, his voice low. A moment. Karl approached. Vogel's face looked pale in the fading light, older than his 30 years. He glanced around to ensure no one else listened. There are rumors from units south of here, Vogel said. About new American shells. Something different. They say these rounds punch through anything. Panthers. Tigers. Everything. Karl frowned. Ghost stories. Every front has them. Perhaps. Vogel took a long drag from his cigarette. But the men who tell these stories are not fools. They are survivors. And survivors learn to pay attention. Karl said nothing. He had heard whispers too, fragments of conversation in supply depots and aid stations. Something about tungsten cores. Something about armor that no longer protected. He had dismissed it as battlefield paranoia, the kind of fear that spread when men spent too long under fire. Just stay alert tomorrow, Vogel said. Trust your eyes, not your armor. Karl returned to his tank as darkness fell. His crew had finished their preparations. Werner cleaned the breech of the 75mm gun. Heinrich organized ammunition by type. Otto checked the engine one final time, listening for any sound that might mean trouble. They ate cold rations in silence. Black bread, tinned meat, ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt acorns. Heinrich asked about Karl's family back in Bavaria. Karl spoke briefly about his sister, his mother, the farm where he grew up. He did not mention that he had stopped writing letters. Some things were too heavy to put into words. Later, Karl climbed onto the turret and watched the stars appear through breaks in the clouds. The rain had finally stopped. Tomorrow would be clear. Good weather for fighting. Good weather for dying. That he thought about Vogel's warning. New shells. Armor that meant nothing. It sounded impossible. The Panzer IV had kept him alive through 100 engagements. Its steel skin had stopped bullets, shrapnel, and enemy rounds. He had learned to trust it the way a man trusts the ground beneath his feet, but Vogel's eyes had held something Karl recognized. Fear. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slow fear of a man who understood that the rules had changed and no one had told him how. Dawn came gray and quiet. Engines rumbled to life across the assembly area. Exhaust smoke rose into the still air. Karl took his position in the commander's cupola and gave the signal to advance. His column moved forward into the mist, toward the crossroads, toward something waiting in the silence ahead. The myth of invincibility rolled with them, fragile as morning frost. The shell that killed Feldwebel Müller made no sound that Karl could remember afterward. One moment, Müller's Panzer IV rolled beside him through the morning fog. The next moment, fire erupted from its hull like a volcano breaking through ice. Karl screamed for Otto to halt. Through his vision port, he watched Müller's tank shudder and stop, flames pouring from every hatch. No one emerged. No one ever would. The ammunition inside cooked off with a series of muffled explosions, rocking the burning hulk on its tracks. 600 meters ahead, 3 American Shermans emerged from a tree line like wolves stepping out of shadow. Karl recognized their silhouettes instantly, but something looked wrong. The gun barrels were longer than he expected, thinner and more threatening. These were not the short-barreled Shermans he had faced before. These carried the new 76mm high-velocity guns, weapons designed specifically to kill tanks like his. Target front, 600 meters. Karl shouted. Werner traversed the turret with desperate speed. The gun breech clanged as Heinrich slammed around home. Werner fired. The shell struck the lead Sherman's turret at an angle and sparked away into the trees. A glancing blow. Not enough. The American gunner was faster. Karl felt the impact before he understood what happened. A tremendous clang rang through the hull, followed by a rush of cold air from somewhere it should not exist. He looked down and saw daylight streaming through a hole in the frontal armor. The hole was clean and round, perhaps 50 millimeters across, punched through 80 millimeters of steel as if it were cardboard. The shell had passed between Werner and Heinrich, missing them by centimeters, and exited through the engine deck. Smoke began filling the compartment. Otto screamed that the transmission was destroyed. Out! Everyone out! They scrambled through hatches into the mud. Karl dragged Werner, who seemed dazed, blood trickling from his ear where the shell's passage had ruptured something inside. They crawled behind a stone wall as their tank began to burn. Another Panzer IV took a hit through its glassy plate. The crew bailed out, 3 men running through smoke and fire. The 4th man emerged covered in flames, staggering blindly across the open ground. He collapsed after 10 steps and did not move again. Karl pressed himself against the cold stone and watched the destruction unfold. 4 tanks gone in 90 seconds. Men he had known for years reduced to burning wreckage. The Americans sat at range, methodical and patient, picking targets with terrible precision. The new shells. Vogel's warning. It was all true. Standard armor-piercing ammunition worked by mass and velocity. A heavy steel projectile moving fast enough could punch through enemy armor if the angle and distance were right. But these American rounds were different. Intelligence reports called them HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. They used tungsten carbide cores, a metal harder and denser than steel, wrapped in a lightweight aluminum jacket. When the shell struck armor, the jacket fell away and the tungsten penetrator continued forward at incredible speed, drilling through protection that should have stopped it cold. At 500 meters, these rounds could penetrate over 150 millimeters of armor. Karl's Panzer IV offered 80 millimeters at best. Even the vaunted Panther, with its sloped glassy and heavy protection, became vulnerable. There was no safe angle anymore. There was no safe distance. The rules of armored warfare had changed overnight, and no one had warned them. 3 tanks remained from Karl's company. They retreated behind a collapsed barn as the Americans held their position, content to let the Germans run. Why pursue when you could kill at range? Karl gathered his surviving crew in a drainage ditch. Werner's hearing was damaged. Heinrich shook uncontrollably, his hands too unsteady to hold his rifle. Otto stared at nothing, his mind somewhere far from this muddy field. They had trusted their armor. They had believed the steel would save them. That faith died burning in the morning fog. What happened? Werner asked, his voice too loud, unable to hear himself properly. What were those shells? Karl did not answer. He watched smoke rise from the crossroads where his comrades had died. 8 crews lost. 32 men gone in less than 2 minutes. The easy assignment had become a massacre. Somewhere behind him, more German tanks were moving up. Panthers, perhaps. Maybe tigers. It did not matter. Karl understood now that armor was an illusion. Protection was a lie. The only thing that kept men alive was luck, skill, and the willingness to run when the situation demanded it. That he looked at his crew, these men who had followed him through hell and back. They needed him to be strong. They needed him to have answers. But Karl Brauer had no answers. He had only questions, and the terrible knowledge that tomorrow they would be ordered back to that crossroads to die. The myth of invincibility had shattered. What remained was truth, cold and unforgiving as tungsten steel. Major Hartmann looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since summer. His eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had seen too many reports, signed too many death notifications, and understood that the war was already lost even if no one dared say it aloud. Karl stood at attention in the command bunker, mud still caked on his uniform, the smell of burning fuel still clinging to his skin. Behind him, the 3 surviving tanks of his company sat in a repair depot, crews working frantically to replace damaged tracks and replenish ammunition. You want to know what killed your men? Hartmann said. It was not a question. Yes, Herr Major. Hartmann pulled a folder from his desk and handed it across. The pages inside were stamped with classification markings and covered in technical specifications. Karl read slowly, struggling with unfamiliar terms. Tungsten carbide. Muzzle velocity. Penetration values. HVAP, Hartmann said. High-velocity armor piercing. The Americans have been developing these shells for over a year. Limited production, difficult to manufacture. We believed they would remain rare. We were wrong. The numbers on the page blurred before Karl's eyes. At 500 meters, the 76mm Sherman gun firing HVAP could penetrate 157 millimeters of armor. His Panzer IV offered 80 millimeters of frontal protection. The Panther offered 110 millimeters at optimal angle. The Tiger, 100 millimeters, everything could be killed. Why were we not warned? Karl asked, his voice barely controlled. Hartmann met his eyes without flinching. Because warning you changes nothing. We have no countermeasure. No thicker armor. No wonder weapon waiting in reserve. The only option is to adapt our tactics and pray the Americans cannot manufacture enough of these rounds to equip every tank. Karl understood what Hartmann was not saying. The German war machine was dying. Factories burned under Allied bombing. Fuel supplies dwindled to nothing. Replacements arrived half-trained and terrified. The technological advantage that once made German armor feared across Europe had evaporated. He returned to his crew with the truth heavy in his chest. They sat around a small fire in the repair depot, faces lit by dancing flames. Werner's ear had been bandaged. Heinrich had stopped shaking but would not meet anyone's eyes. Otto cleaned his pistol with mechanical precision, over and over, a nervous habit that meant he was close to breaking. It is called HVAP, Karl told them. Tungsten cores. They punch through our armor like it does not exist. There is no defense. Silence followed. Werner touched the bandage on his ear. Heinrich bowed his head as if in prayer. Otto's hands stopped moving over the pistol. Then what do we do? Werner asked finally, his voice flat with exhaustion. We fight differently. We use terrain. We stay mobile. We never trust the steel to save us. Our armor is just there to stop machine gun bullets and shrapnel now. Against their tanks, we must be faster, smarter, more careful. It sounded hollow even as he said it. They all knew the truth. Tomorrow, orders would come. They would return to the crossroads. They would fight, and probably die, because that was what soldiers did when their country demanded it. That night, Carl sat alone outside the bunker, watching artillery flash on the horizon. The rumble reached him seconds later, a constant drumbeat of destruction. Somewhere in that chaos, men were dying. Somewhere, another tank crew was learning the same lesson he had learned this morning that he thought about writing to his sister. He had not written in 3 months. What could he say? That the war was lost? That he expected to die before Christmas? That everything they had believed about German superiority had been a lie told by men who never had to face enemy tanks? He started a letter anyway, writing by candlelight on the back of an old map. Dear Margaret, I hope this finds you well. The weather here is cold but clear. We are holding the line as best we can. Do not believe everything you hear on the radio. The truth is more complicated. He stopped there. The truth was not complicated. The truth was simple and brutal. They were losing, and nothing could stop it. Morning came too quickly. A runner appeared with new orders. Carl's company, such as it remained, would hold the crossroads at dawn. Reinforcements would arrive eventually. Perhaps panthers. Perhaps tigers. Perhaps nothing at all. Carl gathered his crew one final time. He did not offer speeches about honor or fatherland. Those words meant nothing to men who had seen what HVAP shells did to their comrades. Stay low, he said. Stay moving. Trust each other, not the armor. If we must die, we make them pay for every meter. Werner nodded. Heinrich crossed himself. Otto checked his pistol one more time. They climbed into their tanks and rolled toward the crossroads, toward the Americans, toward whatever waited in the cold dawn light. The weight of knowing pressed down on them all. Frost covered the ground like a burial shroud. Carl watched the sun rise through broken clouds, painting the crossroads in shades of gold and blood. It would have been beautiful if not for the burned hulks of yesterday's battle still smoldering in the morning cold. 3 tanks. 12 men. Against whatever the Americans brought this time, Carl positioned his panzers among the ruins of Bergstein, using collapsed walls and shattered buildings for cover. They dug shallow revetments, piled rubble around their hulls, and planned escape routes for when the shooting started. Every advantage mattered when armor meant nothing. Movement on the ridge, Werner reported, his voice steady despite everything. Carl raised his binoculars. 6 Shermans crested the far hill, spreading into a wide formation as they advanced. He counted the long barrels. All 76mm guns. All carrying the shells that had killed his friends. Hold fire until 400 meters, Carl ordered through the radio. Make every shot count. The wait stretched into eternity. Heinrich hummed a song from home, something about a girl waiting by a river. Otto's breathing came fast and shallow over the intercom. Werner kept his hands perfectly still on the gun controls, a professional to the last. The lead Sherman entered the kill zone. Fire. Werner's shot struck true, punching into the American tank's side armor below the turret ring. The Sherman shuddered, stopped, and began to burn. One down, the remaining 5 scattered, seeking cover behind the same ruins that sheltered Carl's tanks. Return fire screamed overhead, punching through walls and sending stone fragments flying. A near miss struck the building beside Carl's position, collapsing half the structure in a cloud of dust. Move. Go left. Otto gunned the engine, throwing the Panzer IV into motion. They lurched around the corner of a bombed church as an HVAP round passed through the space they had occupied a second before. The shell punched through both walls of an abandoned house and continued into the forest beyond. Carl's company fought from shadow to shadow, firing and moving, never staying still long enough to become easy targets. Another Sherman burned, caught in a crossfire between two panzers. Then another, surprised as it rounded a corner too quickly, but the Americans learned fast that a flanking maneuver caught Feldwebel-Becker's tank in the open. Carl watched helplessly as two Shermans converged on Becker's position, their guns tracking with lethal precision. The first shot missed. The second did not. Becker's panzer exploded, turret separating from hull in a column of fire. "Heinrich, get us behind the mill!" Carl shouted. They raced across open ground as tracer fire stitched the mud around them. A round struck their track guard, sparking off into the morning. Otto skidded the tank behind the stone mill as another shell cracked overhead. 2 tanks left. For Sherman still operational, Carl knew the math. They could retreat. Save themselves. Let the Americans have the crossroads and whatever lay beyond. No one would blame them, but beyond this position lay a field hospital. Carl had seen the tents on his reconnaissance yesterday. Wounded men, nurses, doctors. If the crossroads fell, the Americans would push forward. The hospital would be overrun. "We stay," Carl said. No one argued. They fought for another hour, trading shots and maneuvers with an enemy that grew bolder as German numbers dwindled. Carl's tank killed a fourth Sherman, catching it with a flank shot as it tried to rush their position. Then the Americans boxed them in. Carl saw it happening but could not stop it. 2 Shermans pinned his wingman while a third circled behind. Feldwebel-Braun tried to reverse, tried to escape, but the crossroads had become a cage of fire and steel. The HVAP round entered Braun's tank through the engine deck and exited through the driver's compartment. The panzer rolled to a stop, smoke pouring from every seam. 3 men scrambled out. The fourth did not. Carl was alone. 2 Shermans faced him across 300 meters of churned earth. Their guns tracked his position, patient and deadly. This was how it ended. Not with glory, not with victory, but with the cold arithmetic of tungsten and steel. "Carl." Werner's voice came through the intercom, calm despite everything. "It has been an honor. We are not dead yet." Carl ordered Otto to charge. The engine roared as 30 tons of German steel lurched forward, not retreating but attacking. Werner fired on the move, something they had practiced 100 times but rarely attempted in real combat. The shot went wide, the Americans fired, the round struck the lower hull, exactly where it would cause maximum damage. The engine died instantly. Smoke and fire filled the compartment. Carl felt heat on his face, heard Heinrich screaming somewhere behind him. "Out! Everyone out!" They scrambled through hatches as flames consumed their tank. Carl rolled across the mud, patting out embers on his uniform. Werner crawled beside him, face blackened with soot. Otto and Heinrich emerged from the smoke, coughing and bleeding but alive. American infantry advanced cautiously across the field. Carl and his crew slipped away through a drainage ditch, crawling through freezing water as bullets cracked overhead. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sounds of battle faded behind them. On a hillside overlooking the crossroads, they stopped. Carl watched the Americans secure the position, their tanks rolling past the smoking wreckage of German armor. His tank burned in the distance, a funeral pyre for the myth of invincibility. A retreating medic found them there. He told them the field hospital had been evacuated an hour ago. The delay Carl's company bought had given the wounded time to escape. It was not victory. But it was something. A supply truck took them rearward as evening fell. Carl sat with his crew in silence, watching the forest pass. Werner asked what happened next. Carl did not know. New tanks would come. New shells too. The armor race never ended, but they had survived. For men who trusted each other more than steel. That was the only truth that mattered now. The war would continue without them for a while. But tonight, they were alive. Carl closed his eyes and let the truck carry them away from the crossroads, away from the burning tanks, away from the weight of knowing that armor meant nothing at all.